widow's hammer echoes through the Texas Panhandle. Spring 1883. Each strike a defiance against a world that branded her cursed. Mara Langford, alone with her infant son, builds a cabin from sweat and sorrow, carving a home from the ashes of loss. But when a wounded Comanche warrior stumbles into her clearing, her fragile refuge teeters on the edge of chaos. Will her choice to shield him spark salvation or destruction? A tale of courage and redemption awaits, where every log and every life holds secrets. Subscribe now, share where you're listening from, and uncover what truths emerge when mercy meets vengeance. Can Mara's heart withstand the storm? The Texas Panhandle sun bled orange across the sagebrush plain, spring 1883, casting long shadows that clawed at Mara Langford's boots. Each swing of her hammer drove a nail into the rough-hewn pine, the thwack echoing like a heartbeat in the stillness. Her infant son, swaddled in a frayed blanket, slept against her back, his warmth the only soft thing in a world of sharp edges. Mara's arms ached, her palms blistered beneath worn gloves, but her eyes burned with a fire no grief could douse. 2 months ago, her husband, Ethan, had fallen, blood seeping into the sand during a skirmish over a trickle of river water. Comanche, settlers. Nobody agreed who fired first. The town of Willowbrook didn't care. They branded Mara a jinx, a widow who'd brought death to their doorstep. So she'd left, hauling logs and dreams to this lonesome clearing between 2 dry rivers, determined to build a life from splinters. The air smelled of dust and pine sap, thick with the promise of a storm. Mara paused, wiping sweat from her brow, her braid fraying like rope left too long in the sun. The cabin's skeleton stood half-formed, 4 walls, no roof, a stubborn frame against the endless sky. She'd dragged every log herself, borrowed a cart from a tight-lipped rancher, and staked the foundation with nothing but grit. Her food stores were meager, packed tight in a shallow root cellar. The chimney, half-built, puffed weak smoke. She knelt to lift another plank, her back screaming under the weight, when her mare, tethered to a scrub oak, let out a shrill whinny. The sound cut through the dusk, sharp as a blade. Then silence, heavy and wrong. Mara froze, hammer in hand, heart kicking like a Mustang. Her eyes scanned the tree line where pines stood like sentinels, their needles glinting in the fading light. Something moved, a shadow, staggering, breaking free from the forest's edge. A man, tall and lean, stumbled into the clearing. Blood streaked his chest, a broken arrow jutting from his side. His dark hair clung to his face, and his eyes, wide with pain, locked on hers. A Comanche warrior, his buckskin tunic torn, a bone-handled knife still strapped to his belt. He collapsed against the unfinished cabin wall, one hand clutching the wound, the other raised, palm open. "Don't shoot," he rasped, his English rough, laced with an accent that rolled like distant thunder. "They'll kill me if they see me breathe." Mara's breath caught, her fingers tightening on the hammer. She hadn't seen another soul in weeks, not since a trader swapped her flour for eggs and muttered about early storms. Now, here was this man, bleeding out on her land, his presence a spark in a powder keg. Beyond the clearing, the faint thud of hooves grew louder, a rumble that promised trouble. A posse, likely, armed and itching for a fight. Mara's gaze darted to her son, still asleep, oblivious to the danger creeping closer. The warrior's eyes followed hers, softening for a heartbeat before hardening again. "They're coming," he whispered, voice cracking like dry wood. "Hide me, or I'm dead." Her mind raced. The town already saw her as cursed. Sheltering a Comanche would make her an outcast for good. But turning him over, handing a wounded man to a mob, would carve away the last shred of who she was. Ethan's face flashed in her mind, his laugh, his blood on the sand. She'd sworn to survive, to build this cabin for their son, to prove the world wrong. But this was a choice that could burn it all down. The hooves grew louder, dust rising like a ghost on the horizon. Mara's jaw clenched. She dropped the hammer, grabbed the man's arm, and yanked him toward the woodpile at the cabin's base. He staggered, biting back a groan, blood dripping onto the frost-cracked earth. She shoved him into the shallow cellar, tossing straw over the red stains. "Stay quiet," she hissed, "or we're both ghosts." He sank into the shadows, his breath ragged, eyes glinting with something between fear and defiance. "Then we're already dead," he muttered. Mara straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and turned to face the clearing. The posse was close now, their voices carrying on the wind, gruff, angry, hunting. She adjusted the blanket over her son, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. The cabin stood behind her, unfinished but unyielding, like the life she was fighting to claim. Whatever came next, Mara Langford would meet it standing tall. The wind hissed across the Texas panhandle. Spring 1883, stirring dust into ghosts that danced around Mara Langford's half-built cabin. She stood at the clearing's edge, her infant son's breath warm against her neck, the blanket shielding him from the chill. The posse's hoofbeats thundered closer, a storm of iron and anger, their voices barking like coyotes on a blood trail. Mara's pulse hammered, her eyes locked on the woodpile where she'd hidden the wounded Comanche warrior. His blood still stained her hands, smeared across her knuckles like a brand. She wiped them on her skirt, steadying herself as the first rider broke through the haze. Jed Tanner, his hat low, his rifle glinting like a snake's fang in the dusk. Jed reined in his horse, the beast snorting steam into the cold air. 3 others flanked him, their faces carved from suspicion and whiskey. Mara knew Jed too well, his broad shoulders, his crooked smirk, the man who'd courted her before Ethan won her heart. Now, his eyes raked over her, lingering on the cabin's raw timbers and the hammer at her feet. "No husband, no help," he drawled, leaning forward in the saddle. "Strange kind of woman builds a house alone out here." His men chuckled, their rifles loose but ready. "Some of us have to," Mara said, her voice steady as stone. She shifted her son's weight, his small body a shield and a burden. "If you're hunting, the trail's cold. Nothing here but me and my boy." Jed's smile didn't reach his eyes. Heard tell of a Comanche slipping through, blood on the wind. He swung down from his horse, boots crunching the frost-bitten grass. His men fanned out, circling the cabin like vultures. One kicked at the woodpile, straw scattering. Mara's heart lurched, but her face stayed blank as the prairie sky. "You seen anything, Mara? Or you too busy playing homesteader to notice?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "I see plenty. Like men wasting daylight chasing shadows." Her words were a blade, sharp but careful. Jed stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. He smelled of tobacco and leather, his breath clouding in the chill. "Ethan always said you were stubborn," he muttered. "Look where that got him." The jab landed, but Mara didn't flinch. She thought of the warrior, Tahan he'd called himself, huddled in the cellar, his life leaking into the dirt. If Jed found him, it wouldn't just be Tahan's blood on the ground. The town would turn on her, burn her cabin, take her son. She'd be the widow who harbored an enemy, a name whispered in saloons and churches alike. But if she gave him up, she'd see Ethan's face in every nightmare, his blood on her hands instead of Tahan's. "Search if you want," she said, nodding toward the cabin. "But you're wasting time. Trail's west, not here." Her voice was calm, a river hiding rocks beneath. Jed squinted, his hand resting on his revolver. For a moment, the world held its breath. The wind stilled, the horses quieted. Then he laughed, low and mean. "You always were a hard one, Mara, But we'll be back. Any sign of a Comanche, we shoot first. Ask later." He mounted up, his men following, their hoofbeats fading into the dusk like a receding storm. Mara stood until they were gone, her knees trembling beneath her skirt. She adjusted her son, his soft whimper cutting through her haze. The woodpile was silent, but she felt Tahan's presence like a weight. She crossed the clearing, her boots sinking into the earth, and knelt by the cellar. "They're gone," she whispered, pulling back the straw. Tahan's eyes gleamed in the dark, his breath shallow, his hand pressed to the arrow wound. "You didn't sell me," he murmured, surprise threading his voice. "Didn't save you yet either," she said, glancing at the blood-soaked straw. "Can you move?" He nodded, grimacing as he shifted. "Enough." His gaze flicked to her son. "You risked everything for a stranger." "Not for you," she said, sharp but honest. "For me. For him." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. The choice was made, but the danger wasn't gone. If you're gripped by Mara's stand, by the tension of a choice that could burn her world to ash, hit subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. There's more to this story. Secrets in the storm, truths in the blood. The sky darkened, the first stars pricking through the haze. Mara helped Tahan limp to the cabin's shadow, her mind racing. Jed's threat hung like smoke, and the blood on her hands was a map to trouble. Whatever came next, she'd face it with a hammer in one hand and her son in the other. Darkness swallowed the Texas Panhandle, spring 1883, as Mara Langford eased Tahan through the cabin's narrow doorway, his weight heavy against her shoulder. The sky churned, spitting sand that stung like 1,000 wasps, the wind howling like a banshee through the unfinished walls. Mara's son stirred in his sling, his tiny fists clenching as if sensing the storm's fury. She settled Tahan on a pallet by the hearth, his breath ragged, the broken arrow in his side a cruel thorn. Blood seeped through the cloth she'd tied, dark as ink against his skin. Outside, the world was a blur of grit and shadow, the pines bending low, whispering secrets to the night. Mara lit a single lamp, its flicker casting jagged shapes across the raw timbers. She knelt beside Tahan, her hand steady despite the ache in her bones. "Hold still," she said, voice low, cutting through the storm's roar. She sliced away his torn tunic with Ethan's old knife, revealing the wound, deep, jagged, the arrowhead buried in muscle. Tahan's jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on the ceiling like a man staring down fate. Mara boiled water over the fire, the pot rattling as the wind clawed at the chimney. She tore strips from an old petticoat, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd stitched her life back together too many times. "You don't have to do this," Tahan muttered, his voice rough as gravel. "You've risked enough." "Quiet," she snapped, dabbing the wound with a damp cloth. "I didn't drag you in here to watch you die." Her words were sharp, but her hands were gentle, cleaning blood and dirt with care. The lamp's glow caught the lines of his face, high cheekbones, a scar tracing his jaw, eyes that held a story she didn't dare ask for. Not yet. The storm screamed louder, sand sifting through the wall's gaps, dusting the floor like ash. Tahan shifted, wincing. "I'm Tahan of the Nakoni," he said, unprompted, as if his name was payment for her mercy. "My wife, my brother, they're gone, ambushed by your people, over horses they said we stole." His voice cracked, not with tears, but with rage worn thin. Mara paused, the cloth hovering over his wound. Ethan's death flashed in her mind, blood on sand, a fight over water, no truth left to claim. She knew loss, the kind that carved you hollow and left you standing anyway. "My husband's dead too," she said, eyes on her work. "Shot down 2 months back. Nobody knows who started it. Doesn't matter. He's gone, and I'm here." Her son whimpered, and she adjusted the sling, her hand brushing his soft hair. Tahan's gaze followed, lingering on the boy. "He cries like my son did," he said, so soft it nearly drowned in the storm. "Then hush," Mara replied, "or we'll all be ghosts." She packed the wound with a poultice of sagebrush and boiled cloth, binding it tight. Tahan's breath steadied, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching her like a hawk. The cabin groaned under the storm's weight, the walls shaking as if the land itself wanted to tear them apart. Mara stood, fetching a tin cup of water from the barrel. She handed it to Tahan, their fingers brushing, calloused and blood-stained. "You fix walls," he said, nodding at the cabin's frame. "I can fix what's broken outside. If I live." A faint smile ghosted his lips, gone as quick as it came. "If you live," she echoed, no promise in her voice. She moved to the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The flames hissed, spitting sparks that mirrored the tension in her chest. Jed Tanner's words hung like smoke. "We'll be back." She glanced at Tahan, his knife still at his belt, a reminder of the line they walked. Trust was a luxury neither could afford, but necessity bound them tighter than a rope. The storm raged on, sealing them in a cocoon of sand and shadow. Mara sat by the fire, her son's weight grounding her, Tahan's breathing a faint rhythm against the wind's howl. She clutched Ethan's knife, its handle worn smooth by years of use. The night stretched long, each creak of the cabin a warning, each gust a threat. Tahan's eyes met hers across the firelight, and for a moment, the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath. They were two souls caught in the same trap, building something fragile in a world that wanted it broken. Dawn was coming, but so was trouble, and Mara knew the sand would settle to reveal more than dust. The first light of dawn crept over the Texas Panhandle, spring 1883, painting the sagebrush in streaks of gold and gray. The sandstorm had passed, leaving Mara Langford's cabin dusted with grit, its wall standing defiant against the night's wrath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sage and blood, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Mara sat by her son, his soft breaths a steady rhythm, while Tahan lay on the pallet, his chest rising shallowly, the poultice holding but not healing. The silence felt fragile, like a cracked window waiting for a stone. Outside, the world stirred. A rustle of brush, a snap of twigs, sharp as a warning shot. Mara's hand tightened on Ethan's knife, her eyes darting to the door. The sound grew louder. Hooves, deliberate. Not the storm's echo, but men returning with purpose. She rose, heart pounding, and peered through a gap in the wall. 4 riders emerged from the haze, Jed Tanner at the lead, his face hard as flint. His men spread out, rifles drawn, their boots kicking up dust that swirled like smoke. Mara glanced at Tahan, his eyes open now, glinting with the same resolve she'd seen in Ethan before a fight. "They found the blood," he whispered, voice rough but steady, nodding toward the trail of red that led to the creek. "Stay down," Mara hissed, shoving the knife into her belt. She adjusted her son's sling, his weight anchoring her as she stepped outside, the morning chill biting her skin. Jed dismounted, his eyes scanning the ground, locking on the faint stains near the woodpile. "Told you we'd be back, Mara," he called, voice low and mean. "You're hiding something." Blood don't lie. His men closed in, one kicking at the cellar's edge, the straw shifting to reveal a dark smear. Mara stood tall, her voice cold as the creek. "You're chasing ghosts, Jed. Nothing here but me and my boy." Her hand rested near the knife, her pulse a drumbeat. Jed's gaze flicked to her son, then back to her, his smirk twisting. "You always were a liar," he said, stepping closer. "Where's the Comanche? I smell him on you." Before Mara could answer, The cabin door creaked. Tahan stepped out, slow, deliberate, the arrow wound seeping fresh blood through the bandage. His knife remained sheathed, his hands empty but raised, palms open like a man facing a firing squad. "I'm here," he said, his English clear, voice steady as stone. "You took my wife, my brother. Let her be." His eyes met Mara's for a heartbeat, a silent plea to stay back. Jed's rifle snapped up, the barrel glinting in the dawn. "You don't give orders, savage," he spat. His men raised their weapons, the air crackling with the promise of death. Mara's breath caught, her mind racing. Every choice led to ruin. If she fought, her son could die. If she stood still, Tahan would. Time slowed, the world narrowing to the click of Jed's hammer. The shot came like thunder, splitting the morning. Tahan staggered, a red bloom spreading across his chest, his knees buckling. Mara moved without thinking, snatching Ethan's rifle from inside the door. She fired, the blast deafening, the bullet tearing through Jed's horse. The beast screamed, rearing, and Jed hit the ground, dust exploding around him. His men scattered, cursing, their horses bolting into the brush. Mara stood, rifle smoking, her son's cries piercing the chaos. Tahan collapsed on the porch, his breath a wet rasp. Mara dropped beside him, her hands shaking as she pressed them to his chest, blood warm and slick under her fingers. "Hold on," she whispered, but his eyes were already dimming, fixed on the sky. He fumbled at his neck, pulling free a necklace of polished bone, its beads carved with patterns she didn't understand. He pressed it into her hand, his grip weak but urgent. "Build for him," he gasped, glancing at her son. "Not for hate." His hand fell, his breath stilled, and the light left his eyes as the sun climbed higher. Mara sat frozen, the necklace heavy in her palm. Tahan's blood pooling on the porch. Jed and his men were gone, their hoofbeats fading into the distance, but the weight of what had happened settled like lead in her chest. She looked at her son, his cries softening, and then at the cabin. Half-built, blood-stained, but hers. The morning was quiet now, the prairie holding its breath, waiting for her to decide what came next. The Texas Panhandle sun hung low, spring 1883, casting a golden haze over Mara Langford's clearing, where the silence after Tahan's death felt heavier than the storm that came before. She sat on the porch, her son asleep in his sling, the bone necklace clutched in her hand, its beads warm from her grip. The blood on the boards had dried to a dull rust, marking the spot where Tahan fell. Mara's eyes traced the horizon, half expecting Jed Tanner's return, but the prairie stayed quiet, save for the whisper of sagebrush and the distant call of a hawk. She stood, her boots scuffing the dirt, and knew what she had to do. Bury the man who'd given her a choice and paid for it with his life. She fetched Ethan's shovel from the lean-to, its handle worn smooth by his hands. The ground behind the cabin was hard, baked by sun and grief, but Mara dug, her arms burning with each scoop. Her son stirred, his soft coos a counterpoint to the scrape of metal on earth. She chose a spot beside Ethan's grave, marked by a rough stone she'd carved his name into months ago. The hole deepened, the dirt piling like a debt she couldn't repay. Tahan's body lay wrapped in a blanket, his face still, the warrior's edge softened by death. Mara lowered him into the ground, her hands trembling not from effort, but from the weight of what he'd said. Build for him, not for hate. She covered him with earth, each shovelful a promise to keep moving forward. By midday, sweat soaked her dress, and the grave was done. Mara carved a plank of pine with Ethan's knife, the blade catching the light as she etched. Here lies a man the world called enemy, but the land called him son. She drove it into the soil, the words stark against the wood. Standing back, she looked at the two graves, Ethan's and Tahan's, side by side, bound by her hands and the land's unyielding embrace. Her son whimpered, and she pressed a hand to his head, whispering, "We're still here, little one." The cabin loomed behind her, its walls stronger now, though gaps still let the wind sing through. Mara returned to work, her hammer striking nails with a rhythm that drowned out the ache in her chest. She fitted a new beam to the roof frame, the wood creaking as it settled. The necklace hung from a nail by the door, its beads clattering softly in the breeze, a sound like bones whispering secrets. She paused to touch it, feeling Tahan's last words etched into her resolve. The cabin wasn't just shelter. It was proof she could build something from nothing, even when the world tried to tear it down. Days passed, the spring sun warming the earth. Mara hauled logs, her muscles protesting but never quitting. She patched the chimney, its smoke now rising steady and true. The root cellar held enough to last the season, and the walls grew tighter with each plank. Her son, growing heavier, watched from his sling, his eyes wide as if learning the world through her labor. The prairie came alive. Grass sprouted around the graves, green tips pushing through like a quiet forgiveness. Mara worked in silence, but the necklace's clatter was her companion, a reminder of the man who'd seen her son, and not her shame. One evening, as the sky burned violet, Mara sat on the finished porch, her hands raw but steady. She traced the necklace's beads, their carvings worn smooth by time. The town of Willowbrook hadn't come for her, not yet, but she knew Jed's kind. Men who carried grudges like kindling, waiting for a spark. She'd face them if they came, with Ethan's rifle and Tahan's truth. Her son babbled, his tiny hand grasping her finger, and for the first time since Ethan's death, Mara felt the stir of something new. Not hope, not yet, but a stubborn will to claim this life for them both. The cabin stood complete, its timbers weathered but unbowed, a testament to her hands and heart. The graves behind it held men who'd shaped her, one by love, one by sacrifice. Mara looked out at the panhandle, its vastness no longer a threat, but a challenge. She'd built more than a house. She'd built a home, anchored by loss and lifted by defiance. The wind carried the scent of sage and promise, and as her son's laughter broke the dusk, Mara knew she'd keep building, no matter what the world threw her way. Mara Langford's journey in the Texas Panhandle of 1883, building her cabin through loss and defiance, leaves us with a truth. Homes are forged not just from wood, but from courage and mercy. Her story, etched in blood and bone, asks us to reflect. What would you risk for a stranger's life, for your own redemption? Share your thoughts below. Let us know where this tale found you and what it stirred in your heart. We're grateful for your time, for walking this wild frontier with us. Join us next week for another story, where the land tests the soul and hearts rise unbroken. Until then, keep building your own.